close your eyes and let everything fall away. Tonight, we travel to a place that exists only in the oldest stories of Japan. It is called Takamagahara, the high heavenly plane, and it floats somewhere above the world we know. In this place, long before history began, the gods lived quiet lives among rice fields and weaving halls and slow-moving rivers of cloud. The sky above them was endless, and the light that filled it came from a single radiant being. Her name was Amaterasu Okami, the great goddess who shines in heaven. You may already know her name, though you may not realize it. Western audiences sometimes meet her first in video games, where she appears in Okami as a graceful white wolf restoring color to a dying world. She appears in Persona and in Smite, and her name is borrowed in Naruto for a technique of black flame. But the original myth, the one first written down in the 8th century, is far stranger, funnier, and more human than any of these retellings. That is the story we will tell tonight. To understand how it begins, we must go back a little further. In the myth of the creation of Japan, the father god Izanagi returned from a journey to the underworld, where he had gone searching for his beloved wife. He came back stained with the grief and impurity of that dark place, and so he went to a clear river to wash himself. And as he washed, gods were born from the water that fell away from his body. When he rinsed his left eye, Amaterasu was born, bright as the rising sun. When he rinsed his right eye, her brother Tsukuyomi was born, pale and quiet as the moon. And when he washed his nose, a third child came into being, a wild and restless boy named Susanoo, the god of storms and of the roaring sea. You may recognize that name too. Susanoo lends his shape to characters in Naruto and Persona, always depicted as a mighty armored warrior wreathed in power. But in the oldest telling, he is something more complicated. He is a boy who cannot stop crying. Izanagi gave each of his 3 children a realm to rule. Amaterasu was given the high heavens and the sun. Tsukuyomi was given the night and all its quiet kingdoms. And Susanoo was given the wide, restless sea. But Susanoo did not go to his sea. Instead, he wept and wept for his dead mother, whom he had never known, until his tears dried up the rivers and withered the green mountains. His father at last grew weary of this endless grief and banished him from the world entirely. For a long time, heaven itself knew nothing of this. In Takamagahara, the days drifted one into the next in golden procession. Amaterasu sat in her great weaving hall, where her attendants wove shining cloth from silk finer than mist. The sound of the looms was soft and rhythmic, like slow rain falling on leaves. Outside, the rice fields of heaven stretched green and orderly to the horizon. Narrow channels of water ran between them, catching the light like threads of silver. The air carried the scent of growing rice and distant cedar. Nothing was hurried here. Nothing was afraid. And yet, far below, Susanoo had decided that before he went into his exile, he would climb one last time to heaven to say farewell to his elder sister. He did not ride ahead. He did not send word. He simply began to ascend. Now Susanoo was a storm given the shape of a young man, and he could not move through the world quietly even when he tried. As he rose toward heaven, the mountains of the earth trembled beneath his feet, and the rivers leapt from their beds. The seas rose in great dark walls and then collapsed upon themselves. The wind that came with him carried the smell of lightning. In the weaving hall of heaven, Amaterasu felt the shaking before she heard the sound. The threads on her loom quivered. The bronze vessels on her shelves sang faintly against each other. Her attendants looked up from their work, their faces pale. Amaterasu rose from her seat. She knew the feeling of her brother's presence, but she had not expected him, and the violence of his coming seemed like something else. It seemed like an army. It seemed like an invasion. And so the great goddess did something the old text describes with wonderful, strange detail. She did not wait to find out his intentions. She prepared for war. She gathered up her long hair and bound it into 2 tight loops at the sides of her head, in the style of a man going into battle. She wrapped herself in the armor of a male warrior, layered and bound with cords. She slung a great quiver of 1,000 arrows upon her back, and another quiver of 500 arrows at her side. She took up a bow so powerful that only a god could draw it. Then she walked out of her weaving hall, out into the open plain of heaven, and she planted her feet in the soft earth with such force that her legs sank into the ground as though it were snow. She drew her bow, and she waited. On the far side of the plain, the clouds boiled and broke open, and Susanoo stepped through them. His dark hair hung loose and wild. His robes were storm dark, trailing small flickers of violet lightning. He looked up and saw his sister, armed and ready, her bow bent and her eyes bright as the noon sun. For a long, still moment, the brother and sister simply looked at each other across the heavenly plain. The wind that had followed him was already quieting, but the air between them felt thick, charged, uncertain. Neither of them spoke. And in that silence, in that held breath between suspicion and welcome, our story truly begins. For a long moment, the 2 divine siblings simply stood and looked at each other across the wide plain of heaven. The wind had quieted. The clouds that had carried Susanoo were beginning to thin, breaking apart into pale ribbons that drifted away on currents of warm air. Amaterasu kept her bow drawn. Her hair, bound in 2 tight warrior's loops, caught the light and shone like polished bronze. Her armor was layered and beautiful, each cord knotted with care, and the 1,000 arrows at her back made a soft sound when she shifted her weight. She did not lower her weapon. Susanoo, for his part, opened his hands wide to show that they were empty. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse from weeping and from the long climb through the trembling sky. He told her that he had not come to make war. He told her that he had been banished from the world by their father Izanagi, and that he wished only to see her once before he was sent away forever. He had come, he said, to say goodbye. Amaterasu listened, but she did not believe him. She had felt the mountains shake beneath his coming. She had seen the seas rise in dark walls. A god who came in peace, she thought, did not arrive in such a way. And so she asked him to prove the purity of his heart. In the old language of the myth, this kind of proof was called an ukehai, a sacred pledge. It was a ritual contest in which 2 divine beings would create new life from each other's possessions, and the nature of what they created would reveal the truth of their intentions. They agreed to stand on opposite banks of the heavenly river, the slow silver waterway that flowed across the plain. The river was not deep, but its current was steady, and the air above it was always cool and faintly fragrant with the smell of clean stone. Reeds grew along its edges, swaying gently in the breeze. Amaterasu reached out her hand and asked her brother for the long sword that hung at his side. Susanoo unbound it without protest and passed it across the water to her. She took the blade and broke it into 3 pieces. Then she placed the pieces in her mouth. She rinsed them in the Well of Heaven, a small spring near the riverbank whose water was said to be the source of all clarity. She chewed the metal between her divine teeth until it became something soft and bright. Then she breathed it out as a fine, glowing mist. From that mist, 3 goddesses were born. They stepped out of the air with quiet grace, beautiful and serene, the daughters of the breath of the sun. They would later become the protective deities of the sea routes around Japan, watched over by sailors for centuries afterward. Then it was Susanoo's turn. He asked Amaterasu for the long strings of curved jewels she wore in her hair and twined around her arms. These were magatama, comma-shaped beads of polished green stone, strung together on cords of fine silk. They were precious to her, but she gave them across the river without hesitation. Susanoo took the jewels and placed them in his own mouth. He rinsed them in the heavenly well, just as his sister had done. He chewed them until they too became a soft, glowing mist, and then he breathed them out across the river. From that mist came 5 gods, all of them male, stepping one by one into the light of the heavenly plane. The 2 siblings looked at the 8 new deities standing between them, 3 goddesses and 5 gods, and they considered what had happened. Then Susanoo lifted his head and declared that he had won the pledge. The 5 male gods, he said, had come from his breath, and male children were the proof of a pure and gentle heart. Therefore, his intentions were innocent, and his victory was complete. Amaterasu listened to this and said nothing for a moment. The logic was a little strange, even by the standards of the gods. The male children had come from her jewels, after all, not from anything that originally belonged to him. But she did not argue. She lowered her bow at last, and she allowed her brother to remain in heaven for a little while. Now this strange contest, with its chewing of swords and breathing of new gods, may sound unlike anything in Western mythology. But it is one of the oldest and most important moments in the Kojiki, the 8th century chronicle that first wrote down these stories. The 5 male gods born from Amaterasu's jewels would become the divine ancestors of the Japanese imperial family, and their lineage is still traced today. Every emperor of Japan, including the one who reigns now, descends mythologically from this single moment beside the heavenly river. For a few quiet days, things in heaven seemed almost as they had been before. Susanoo wandered the plain, half guest and half stranger. He visited the rice fields and the orchards. He stood at the edge of the silver river and watched the reeds bend in the wind. But there was a brittleness in the air now, a thinness like the surface of ice. Amaterasu went back to her weaving hall and tried to return to her work, but she did not unbind her warrior's hair. Her attendants noticed this, and they whispered to each other softly as they passed bobbins of silk between their hands. In the corners of the heavenly halls, the bronze vessels stood very still. The shadows lay long and pale across the wooden floors. Outside, beyond the rice fields, The wind sometimes carried a faint smell of distant lightning, as though something far away was waiting. Susanoo, declared the winner of a contest he had perhaps not truly won, was beginning to feel the strange, wild joy of a god who believes he has been proven innocent. And in the quiet of those few peaceful days, that joy was already turning, slowly and silently, into something else. The peace did not last. It rarely does, in stories of gods or of mortals, but in this case the peace was thinner than most, and it broke more strangely than anyone in heaven could have imagined. Susanoo, drunk on his declared victory, began to wander the heavenly plain with a wild new lightness in his step. He had been judged innocent, in his own mind at least, and innocence felt to him like permission. Permission, he decided, to do whatever he liked. He began with the rice fields. These were not ordinary fields. They were the sacred paddies of Amaterasu herself, tended by divine hands, and the rice grown in them was the food of the gods. Each field was carefully divided from its neighbors by low ridges of earth, and clear water ran between them through narrow channels cut with great care. Susanoo walked into these fields and tore down the dividing ridges with his bare hands. He kicked the soft earth into the channels until the water could no longer flow. He stamped on the young rice plants until the green shoots lay broken and silent in the mud. To a modern listener, this may sound like the petty vandalism of a bored child. But in ancient Japan, where rice was the foundation of life and the very symbol of divine order, destroying a sacred rice paddy was an act of profound spiritual violence. It was a rejection of the world itself. The other gods of heaven saw what was happening, and they whispered among themselves, but they did not yet act. Amaterasu, in her weaving hall, heard the rumors. And she did something that would surprise anyone who has ever known a wronged elder sister. She made excuses for him. Perhaps, she said, he had not destroyed the ridges out of malice. Perhaps he had thought the land was being wasted and that the fields could be made larger. Perhaps the channels had been filled by accident as he passed through. She offered, in her gentle way, every excuse she could find. The attendants in the weaving hall lowered their eyes and said nothing. The looms clicked softly. The afternoon light slanted long and warm across the wooden floors, and outside, the broken rice fields lay quiet under the sun. Susanoo, hearing that his sister had defended him, did not take it as kindness. He took it as weakness. And so he went further. He entered the sacred palace where Amaterasu held the harvest festival each year, the great hall in which the first new rice of the season was offered to the gods. This was the holiest building in heaven. The polished wooden floors had been blessed by countless rituals. The air inside was always still and slightly cool, scented faintly with cedar and old incense. What Susanoo did inside that palace, the old chronicle records with startling plainness. He defiled it. He left his own filth upon the sacred floor where the harvest offerings would soon be laid. The Kojiki does not soften this detail, and so neither will we. When this too was reported to Amaterasu, she once again searched for an excuse. Perhaps her brother had been ill, she said. Perhaps he had been confused, or had not known where he was. She sent her attendants to clean the palace, and she returned to her loom, and she tried very hard not to think about it. But there is a kind of patience that begins to look like denial, and a kind of denial that quietly invites the very thing it fears. Somewhere in the bright heavens, Susanoo was deciding what he would do next. In a distant pasture of heaven, there grazed a creature called the heavenly piebald horse. Its coat was patterned with patches of dark and light, and it was considered a sacred animal, beloved of the gods. Susanoo found this horse and led it away. What he did next is one of the strangest and most taboo acts in all of Japanese myth. He flayed the horse. And he did not flay it in the ordinary way, from head to tail, but in the reverse direction, peeling its skin backward from the tail toward the head. In ancient Japanese belief, this reverse flaying was the deepest possible violation, an act of pure spiritual reversal. Then he carried the flayed body of the horse across the heavenly plain, all the way to his sister's weaving hall. He climbed onto the roof, and he tore an opening in the thatch above the loom room, and he hurled the body down through the hole. Inside the hall, Amaterasu was at her loom, weaving with her favorite attendant beside her. The maiden was a quiet young goddess of weaving, beloved of the sun. Her hands moved among the silken threads with the easy grace of long practice, and she was humming something low and tuneless to herself. Then the roof above her broke open, and the broken body of the heavenly horse fell into the hall. The weaving maiden cried out in shock and threw herself backward, and in her terror she struck herself against her own loom shuttle. The wound was sudden and deep, and she was fatally hurt by the very tool of her gentle craft. She fell to the floor of the weaving hall, among the scattered silk and the broken rhythm of the loom, and she did not rise again. For a moment, there was no sound in the hall at all. The other attendants stood frozen. The loose threads on the loom swayed slowly in the dim air. The body of the maiden lay still upon the wooden floor, and her last breath had already gone out of her. Amaterasu rose from her seat very slowly. She did not speak. She looked at her dead attendant, and at the broken roof above, and at the ruined weaving, and at the patches of sunlight falling through the hole onto the floor. Something inside the great goddess of the sun, something that had been bending for days, finally and quietly broke. She turned away from the loom. She turned away from her attendants and her sacred hall and her endless patience. And without a word to anyone, she walked out of the weaving hall and into the bright afternoon of heaven, with a single thought forming itself in the deep silence of her grief. She wanted more than anything in the world to be alone. Amaterasu walked out of her weaving hall and across the heavenly plain in silence. The afternoon was still warm. The light still fell golden across the rice fields and the slow silver river, and the wind still moved gently through the reeds. All of it, every part of it, came from her. She did not look back at the broken roof of the weaving hall. She did not look at the attendants who watched her go from the doorway, their hands pressed to their mouths. She walked, and she carried her grief inside her like something heavy and very quiet. There was a place she knew. It lay at the far edge of the heavenly plain, where the soft hills folded into one another, and the ground rose into a great cliff of dark stone. Set into the base of that cliff was the entrance to a cave, a deep hollow in the rock that had been there since the world began. It was called Ama no Iwato, the heavenly rock cave. She walked toward it slowly, the way one walks toward a long-promised rest. The grass beneath her feet was soft and cool. The air at the foot of the cliff smelled of moss and old stone, faintly damp, faintly sweet. The mouth of the cave was dark, and the dark inside it was deeper than any shadow she had ever made. Amaterasu stepped into that darkness without hesitation. The cool of the cave closed around her like cloth. She walked a little way inside until the soft sounds of the heavenly plain could no longer be heard. And then she turned, and she set her shoulder against the great stone door at the cave's mouth, and she pushed it closed behind her. The stone settled into place with a low, final sound. And in that moment, every light in the universe went out. It happened all at once. The sun above the heavenly plain, which had been shining warm and gold a heartbeat before, simply was not there anymore. The sky did not fade through the colors of evening. There was no slow dusk. There was only light, and then no light. And the difference between them was the closing of a door. In the weaving hall, the attendants stood in absolute blackness, unable to see their own hands. In the rice fields, the broken green shoots could no longer be seen at all. The silver river of heaven still flowed, but no one could see it shine. Across the wide plain, the gods called out to one another and could not find each other in the dark. And far below, in the world of mortals, the same thing happened. The sun vanished from the sky over the islands and the seas. Farmers in their fields stood very still, holding their tools, looking up at a black sky with no stars. Mothers gathered their children indoors. Fishermen out on the dark water bent their heads and prayed to gods whose names they suddenly could not remember. The world had not simply lost its light. It had lost the source of all light, and there was no promise that the source would ever return. Now, listeners who know the myths of ancient Greece may recognize something familiar in this moment. In the Greek tradition, there is a story of the goddess Demeter, whose daughter Persephone was taken into the underworld. In her grief, Demeter withdrew her gifts from the world, and the green earth withered into the first winter, and humanity nearly perished from cold and hunger. A goddess, wounded by sorrow, retreats. The world dies behind her. The Japanese version is different in one important way. In the Greek story, the gods solve the problem by bargaining with the lord of the underworld, by making contracts and exchanges, by negotiating with darkness. In the Japanese story, as we will see, the gods do something stranger and far more communal. They invent a party. But that is for a later chapter. For now, in the long darkness, things began to go wrong. The Kojiki tells us with quiet alarm that the 8 million spirits of mischief and sickness, which had always lurked at the edges of the bright world, came creeping out of their hiding places. They moved in the dark plains of heaven and along the dark roads of the world below, and their voices were small and many and hungry. Nothing grew. Nothing ripened. The rice in the fields stopped reaching upward because there was no longer anything to reach toward. Streams ran cold. The blossoms on the heavenly trees closed their petals and would not open them again. Inside the cave, Amaterasu sat upon the smooth stone floor and rested her back against the wall. She did not weep. Her grief had passed beyond weeping into something quieter and deeper, the kind of stillness that follows a great loss when the first sharpness of it has worn down to a dull ache. The cave around her was utterly black, but she carried her own faint light. and that light moved in soft pulses against the cave walls. She could see the rough texture of the stone if she looked closely. She could see the slow drip of water from a high crack somewhere above. The air was cool and very still. It is worth pausing here to note that the Heavenly Rock Cave is not only a place in a story. In the mountains of Miyazaki Prefecture, in the south of Japan, there is a real shrine called Amano Iwato, which is said to mark the very spot where this cave once opened. Pilgrims still travel there today, walking quietly beneath the cedars to gaze across a river at a dark hollow in the cliffs on the far side. They bow their heads, and they think of the goddess inside. Some scholars have suggested that this entire myth may be the memory of an ancient solar eclipse, preserved in story long after the event itself was forgotten. Others believe it is a deeper tale about grief and withdrawal, and the way the world feels when someone we love decides they cannot bear to face it any longer. Both readings, perhaps, are true at once. Inside her cave, Amaterasu closed her eyes. She did not know how long she would stay there. She thought, perhaps, that she would stay forever. And outside, in the silent dark plain of heaven, the other gods were beginning to gather. In the long darkness that followed Amaterasu's withdrawal, the gods of heaven did not at first know what to do. They wandered the black plain, calling softly to one another, reaching out their hands and finding only cold air. Some sat down where they were and waited. Some wept quietly, the way one weeps in a sick room at night. But after a while, a quiet understanding began to pass among them. If they were going to do anything at all, they would have to do it together. One by one, they began to move toward the same place, drawn by instinct and by old habit, the way a flock of birds finds its way home in the dusk. The place they gathered was the dry bed of the heavenly river. It was a long, smooth stretch of pale stones beside the silver water, the sort of place where councils had always been held in heaven when there was something to decide. The river still flowed beside it in the dark, soft and unseen. The stones beneath their feet were cool and worn round by ages of slow water. The old chronicle tells us that 8 million gods came to this gathering. The number is not meant to be taken literally. In the language of ancient Japan, 8 million simply meant a number too large to count, an infinity of small and great divinities, the spirits of every river and stone and cedar tree, the deities of every craft and harvest and household. All of them came. All of them sat down in the dry riverbed in the dark. Someone, somewhere among the gathered gods, struck a small flame. A torch was lit, and then another and another, until small pools of warm orange light bloomed across the riverbed. The faces around each flame were soft and uncertain. The light caught on the edges of robes and the curves of hands, and the deep blue darkness beyond the torches felt suddenly less endless than before. In the middle of the gathering sat a god who was known to all of them as the wisest in heaven. His name was Omoikane, which means something like the one whose thoughts combine many things. He was the god of deep thinking, of plans, and of careful consideration. He was old, and his long gray hair fell about his shoulders, and his beard was as fine as river mist. The other gods turned to him in the firelight, and they asked him what they should do. Omoikane did not answer at once. He was a god who liked to take his time. He sat very still, his eyes half closed, and he listened to the soft crackle of the torches and the distant whisper of the river. He understood something that not all the gods had yet understood. Amaterasu could not be commanded to come out of the cave. She could not be reasoned with through the stone door, because grief, when it is fresh, does not listen to reason. She could not be pulled out by force, because she was the great goddess of the sun, and there was no one in heaven strong enough to move her if she did not wish to be moved. What was needed, Omoikani realized, was something stranger. Something that would reach past her sorrow without confronting it. Something that would catch her by curiosity and by surprise, and perhaps even by delight. They would have to make her wonder. They would have to make her listen for a sound she could not place, and look for a light she could not explain. When at last he spoke, the gathered gods leaned forward to hear him. His voice was low and unhurried, and he laid out his plan piece by piece, like a man arranging stones along a path. First, he said, they would need long singing roosters. These were the sacred birds whose voices called the sun out of the night each morning. The gods would gather many of them, the longest voiced and the loudest, and they would set them before the cave to crow together. If anything in the universe could remind the sun of her morning duty, it would be the voices of the birds who had waited on her every dawn since the world began. This is one of the small details that has lived on in the real world for thousands of years. At the great Ise Grand Shrine in Japan, which is dedicated to Amaterasu herself, sacred chickens still wander freely through the forested grounds today. Visitors stand quietly and watch them peck among the gravel paths, and the priests will tell you, if you ask, that these birds are the living echoes of the roosters who called the goddess out of her cave. Next, Omoikun said, they would need a mirror. Not an ordinary mirror, but one forged in heaven by the divine smith, polished until it could catch and hold light as a bowl holds water. The smith god was sent for, and his hammer began to ring out somewhere in the darkness, and the sound of it was the first hopeful sound the gods had heard in a long while. Then they would need jewels. Long strings of curved magatama beads, the same comma-shaped green stones that Amaterasu had once worn in her hair beside the heavenly river. A jeweler god was set to work threading them onto cords of fine silk, his fingers moving carefully in the warm light of a single torch. And then, Omoikani said, they would need a tree. A great sakaki tree, the evergreen sacred to the gods, with its dark glossy leaves and its small white flowers. Several of the strongest gods went out into the dark, feeling their way to a hillside where such a tree was known to grow, and they uprooted it whole, with all its roots still trailing earth, and they carried it back to the gathering. When the tree was set upright in the dry riverbed, the other gods began to dress it. They hung the long strings of magatama jewels on its upper branches. They placed the polished mirror, when it was finished, in the middle branches, where it caught the torchlight and threw it back in soft, trembling waves. They fastened white paper streamers and strips of cloth to the lower branches, where they hung still in the windless dark. It is from this very moment in the myth that many of the most familiar objects of Shinto practice are said to come. The two great sacred treasures hung upon that tree, the mirror called Yata no Kagami and the jewels called Yasakani no Magatama, are still counted among the 3 sacred treasures of Japan today. They are said to be kept in shrines so holy that no human eye has ever been permitted to look upon them. The plan was nearly ready. But Omoikane knew that all of these things, the birds and the mirror and the jewels and the tree, would not be enough on their own. They needed one thing more. They needed someone who could draw the goddess's attention through the stone door itself. Someone whose presence could rise above the silence of grief and become impossible to ignore. They needed a dance. And they needed a dancer. Across the firelit gathering and the warm flicker of the torches, the eyes of the 8 million gods began to turn slowly toward a single figure standing at the edge of the crowd. Her hair was wild and adorned with leaves, and her robes were simple, and she was already beginning, very softly, to smile. Her name was Ame no Uzume, and she was the goddess of dawn and of merriment, of wild laughter, and of the kind of joy that arrives without being invited. She had been waiting at the edge of the gathering for some time. She had heard the council unfold, and she had understood, before anyone said it aloud, what was going to be asked of her. When the eyes of the 8 million gods turned toward her, she did not hesitate. She stepped forward into the warm circle of torchlight, and she began to prepare. First, she gathered leaves from the heavenly hillsides, the broad, shining leaves of the sacred sasa bamboo, and she wound them into her wild, dark hair until her head was crowned with green. She tied a sash of climbing vines around her waist. She took a small bundle of bamboo grass into her hand to use as a kind of wand. She moved without hurry, and there was something already half-trance about her, as though the dance had begun before her feet had moved at all. The other gods, watching her, brought forward an empty wooden tub, the sort used for storing rice or for washing cloth. They turned it upside down on the stones of the dry riverbed, just in front of the entrance to the cave, where the sacred sakaki tree stood with its mirror and its jewels. They pressed it firmly into the ground so that it would hold her weight. Uzume climbed onto the overturned tub. She stood there for a moment, balanced and still, looking out over the gathered crowd of gods in the trembling firelight. Then she began to stamp her feet upon the wood. The sound was small at first, a slow, soft drumming that rose into the dark air. But the wood of the tub was hollow, and her feet were divine, and very quickly the drumming became a deep, rhythmic boom that echoed across the dry riverbed and out across the silent plain of heaven. The 8 million gods felt it in their chests. Some of them, without quite knowing why, began to sway. Uzume's eyes fluttered closed. Her head tilted back. The bamboo wand in her hand began to move in slow circles, then in faster ones, and the leaves in her hair caught the torchlight as she turned. A divine trance was rising in her, the kind of holy madness that the old Japanese tradition has always recognized as a doorway between the human and the sacred. And then, in the midst of her dance, something happened that the Kojiki records with absolute matter-of-fact plainness, and which has made readers smile for over 1,000 years. Ame no Uzume, deep in her trance, loosened the sash at her waist. Her simple robes fell open. She bared her breasts to the firelight. She let her clothing fall away from her body until she stood upon the overturned tub almost entirely revealed. She did not stop dancing. She did not seem to notice. Her feet kept their pounding rhythm on the wood, and her arms rose and fell in slow, ecstatic arcs, and the leaves in her hair trembled around her face. For one heartbeat, the 8 million gods were stunned into silence. They had come to this gathering in mourning. They had expected, perhaps, a solemn ritual. They had not expected this. And then, all at once, they began to laugh. It started somewhere near the front, a small, startled sound, the kind of laugh that escapes against your will. It spread outward like a wave. The gods of the rivers laughed, and the gods of the mountains laughed, and the gods of the rice fields and the household hearths and the small, forgotten roads all laughed. They laughed until the tears ran down their cheeks in the firelight. They laughed until the heavenly plain itself began to shake beneath them. The 8 million gods, watching this divine and ridiculous dance in the middle of the darkest moment in the history of the universe, lost all composure. The sound of their laughter rolled across the empty heavens like slow, joyous thunder. And inside the rock cave, the goddess of the sun heard them. She had been sitting in her quiet darkness for what felt like a very long time. She had not expected to hear anything from the world outside. She had certainly not expected to hear laughter. Amaterasu lifted her head and listened. She frowned in the soft glow of her own faint light, and she wondered, what could possibly be happening out there? The world was supposed to be in mourning. The world was supposed to be cold and silent and afraid. And yet, on the other side of the great stone door, the gods were laughing as though something wonderful had happened. What could have made them laugh like that, with the sun gone from the sky? Slowly, very slowly, she rose from her seat against the cave wall. She walked to the stone door. She placed her palm against the cool rock and listened, and the laughter outside grew louder, swelling and falling like the breath of some great living thing. She called out through the door. Her voice was the first sound she had made in days, and it was small and uncertain, almost shy. She asked the gods why they were laughing when the world was in darkness. She asked them what could possibly be the cause of so much joy. Outside the cave, Uzume kept dancing on her overturned tub, but the other gods were waiting for this moment. One of them stepped close to the door and answered. He told the goddess inside that they had found a new sun. A new deity, more radiant and more glorious than Amaterasu herself, had appeared among them, and they were rejoicing in her light. This was, of course, not true. But it was the kind of small, strategic untruth that the wise god Omoikane had built into his plan, knowing that nothing would prick the curiosity of a goddess so deeply as the rumor of a rival. Inside the cave, Amaterasu felt something stir that she had not felt since her grief began. A tiny, warm flame of curiosity. She set her shoulder very gently against the great stone door and pushed it open, just a little, just enough to let a thin crack of dim light spill out into the dark plain. She peered through the gap, and the first thing she saw, hung in the middle branches of the sacred sakaki tree just outside, was a face. A radiant, glowing, beautiful face, surrounded by white gold light. It was, of course, her own reflection in the polished mirror. But she did not understand this in the first moment of seeing it. She had never seen herself before. No goddess of the sun had ever needed a mirror. She saw the radiant being inside the tree branches, and she thought, for one breathless instant, that the gods had been telling the truth. She leaned a little further out of the cave to look. And in that moment, from the side of the cave entrance where he had been waiting in silent shadow, an enormous figure stepped forward. His name was Tajikarao, the god of strong arms, and he was the mightiest of all the gods of heaven. He had been chosen for this single instant. His massive hands closed gently but firmly around Amaterasu's wrist. And he pulled. The great goddess of the sun came stumbling out of her cave into the firelight of the gathered gods, blinking, astonished, half lit by the polished mirror and half by her own returning radiance. And the dry riverbed of heaven began, very slowly, to fill with light. She came out of the cave slowly, blinking in the warm, trembling firelight. The great hand of Tajikarao still gentle around her wrist. Her own radiance had begun to return to her almost without her noticing. It rose softly from her skin and her hair and her layered white robes, and it filled the dry riverbed with a pale gold glow that made the torches seem suddenly small. The 8 million gods fell silent. Their laughter, which had rolled across the plain like thunder only moments before, drained away into a hush of awe. They lowered their heads. Some of them sank to their knees among the smooth, pale stones. Behind her, the mouth of the cave still yawned dark and open, and the gods knew that this was the most dangerous moment of all. She was out, but she might still turn back. Grief is patient. It waits at the edges of every doorway. And so 2 of the gods stepped forward with a great rope. It was a thick, twisted cord of rice straw, woven by divine hands, and they carried it carefully between them. They drew it across the entrance of the cave, from one side of the dark stone to the other, and they fastened it firmly in place. One of them spoke a soft word, and the rope was sealed. Amaterasu turned and looked back at it. The cave behind the rope was still her cave, and she could still see its cool darkness. But the rope said very gently that she was not to return. That door was closed now. The world needed her on this side of it. This rope is called a Shimenawa, and it has never disappeared from the world. If you walk into any Shinto shrine in Japan today, in any city or any small mountain village, you will see a Shimenawa hanging across the entrance, or wound around an ancient tree, or stretched between 2 stones in the sea. It marks the boundary between the sacred and the ordinary. Every one of them, every single one, is a quiet echo of the rope that was tied across the cave on the night the sun came home. Slowly, Amaterasu lifted her face toward the sky. The deep black above the heavenly plain began to soften. A faint, pale blue bled into the eastern horizon, the first true color the universe had seen in what felt like forever. Then a thin band of rose, low and trembling. Then a slow, widening hush of gold. The first dawn after the long night had begun. It came gently, the way real dawns come. No sudden blaze, no triumphant burst. Just the soft and patient unfolding of light into the world. The way a flower opens. The way breath returns to a sleeping body. The pale stones of the dry riverbed turned the color of warm honey. The silver river, suddenly visible again, threw little flashes of light from its slow surface. Far below, in the world of mortals, the same dawn was rising. Farmers who had stood frozen in their dark fields lifted their heads and saw the first thin line of pink along the horizon. Mothers carried their children to the doorways of their homes and pointed at the sky. Fishermen on the dark water watched the eastern edge of the sea begin to glow, and they wept quietly into their nets, and they did not know why. The blossoms on the heavenly trees opened their petals again, slowly, one by one. The young rice in the fields, even the broken shoots, turned toward the warmth. The 8 million spirits of mischief and sickness that had crept out into the dark slipped away again into their hidden corners, blinking and unhappy. The world remembered itself. There was, of course, still the matter of Susanoo. He had been kept somewhere apart during the long darkness, watched by a few of the gods, and now he was brought before the gathered assembly in the soft new light. His wild, dark hair hung loose around his face. His storm-dark robes were dimmed. The crackle of violet energy that had once surrounded him was gone, or had at least grown very small. The gods judged him there, in the gentle dawn, beside the silver river. They did not destroy him. They did not ask Amaterasu to look at him at all, and she did not ask to look. They simply cut his beard and pulled out his fingernails and toenails and laid upon him 1,000 offerings of expiation. And then they sent him away. He was banished from heaven forever. He went down out of the high plain by the long bridge of clouds, and he descended into the world of mortals, where his wild story would continue in places far from the weaving halls of his sister. But that is another myth, for another night. For now, in the soft, golden hush of the first dawn, the gods of heaven simply stood and breathed. Many of them did not speak at all. They watched the light grow slowly stronger across the plain, and they felt the warmth return to the air. And they understood that something very precious had almost been lost, and had been quietly given back. Amaterasu walked slowly away from the cave and the sacred tree and the gathered gods. She walked back across the heavenly plain toward her weaving hall, and the light walked with her. Every blade of grass she passed turned a little greener. Every drop of dew on every leaf caught the morning and held it. The silver river of heaven shone like a long ribbon laid carefully across the world. The cedars on the distant hills stirred faintly in a warm breeze that none of them had felt in days. The air smelled of wet earth and growing things and the faint sweetness of new sun on old stone. There is a quiet thought worth holding here at the end. Every emperor of Japan, including the one who lives today, traces his lineage all the way back to Amaterasu, the goddess in this story. And the mirror that drew her out of her cave, the Yata no Kagami, is said to be enshrined still at the Ise Grand Shrine, hidden from every human eye. The story you have just heard is not, for many people in Japan, only a story. It is the beginning of everything. But you do not need to remember any of that now. You do not need to remember the names, or the rope, or the mirror, or the dance. You can let all of it drift away, the way the morning mist drifts off the surface of a slow river. What remains is only the soft light, the warmth of a returning sun on a quiet plain, the hush of a world that has been afraid and is afraid no longer, the sense, deep and old and wordless, that the light always comes back, even after the longest night, even after the door has closed. Amaterasu reached her weaving hall in the gentle morning. She stepped inside, and she sat down once again at her loom, and she let her warrior's hair come loose at last. The threads on the loom caught the new light and began to shine. Outside her open doorway, the heavenly plain stretched golden and quiet to the horizon. And somewhere far below, on a small dark island in a wide sea, the dawn was reaching the edge of the world. A single bird called once. Then it was silent again. Then the light came in. Sleep now. The sun has come home. This has been Kaito. Thank you for wandering through the dawn of these ancient islands with me tonight. Let the comforting crackle of the hearth fire carry you gently to sleep. Sleep well. Good night.